Coming up on our newscast tonight. South Korean train cars linked up to a locomotive and cars from the north will move along select railways in North Korea to conduct the two sides' joint on-site survey. Seoul expresses confidence in holding a groundbreaking ceremony for the Inter-Korean Rail project before the year is up. President Moon Jae-in is in Argentina, the second stop in his three-nation tour, when he meets with U.S. President Donald Trump on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Buenos Aires. Hopes are high progress will be made in issues linked to diplomacy with North Korea. South Korea's central bank raises its benchmark interest rate to 1.75%. With its first hike since last November, the key lending rate is now at its highest level since June of 2015. News Center begins now. It's 8 p.m. here in Korea, live from our studio in Seoul. This is Arirang News Center. Welcome to our program. I'm Daniel Choi. South Korean researchers and train cars crossed the border this morning for a joint on-site survey of North Korea's railways. Seoul's government will prepare to break ground on a project to connect the two sides' railways by the end of this year. Oh Jung-hee has our top story.
남북 공동 조사열차 출무 신고하겠습니다. 도산역에서 판문역까지 7.3km 열차 안전운행에 최선을 다하겠습니다. 여러분께 인사 안전하로.
With that salute to South Korean officials, Seoul's researchers and train cars left for the joint on-site survey of North Korean railways on Friday. They're comprised of 28 inspectors and 7 train cars, with a locomotive and 6 cars carrying oil and electricity, as well as living facilities for the researchers who will basically use the trains as shelter. At the North's Panmun station, South Korean train cars are linked up to a North Korean locomotive and cars. For the next 2.5 weeks, the trains will move along the western Gyeongui line first, and then the eastern Donghae line for testing purposes. This will be the first time in over 10 years that the two Koreas have inspected the Gyeongui line, and the first time in history they've surveyed the Donghae line. A ceremony was held on Friday morning at South Korea's northernmost Dorasan train station to wish farewell and good luck to the researchers and train cars. South Korea's Transport and Unification ministers expressed hope that the on-site survey will be a stepping stone to ultimately connect South Korean railways with the North.
Today's ceremony will be a signal of the two Koreas' co-prosperity through a railway connection and provide momentum to expand the Korean peninsula's economic reach to the Eurasian continent.
The government will prepare steadily to hold a groundbreaking ceremony within this year, as the leaders of South and North have agreed, and closely coordinate with related countries so that the railway connection project can go ahead with support from the international community.
Seoul is still confident that the two Koreas can hold the groundbreaking ceremony before the end of this year, despite many delays. But it's widely seen that the ceremony will only be a symbolic move, with Seoul saying actual construction work will proceed in accordance with progress in North Korea's denuclearization. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
Steps towards building trust and establishing peace around the border area between the two Koreas have been continuously taken. Some tangible results are coming in. Seoul and Pyongyang finally completed demolishing 10 guard posts each in the DMZ. Our Defense Ministry correspondent Park Ji-won fills us in.
A military source tells Arirang News the work to demolish the guard posts was finished as of Friday afternoon. The 20 guard posts, 10 on each side, were located within 1 kilometer of the military demarcation line. They were torn down in a process that started early this month to implement the Inter-Korean military agreement from the September summit. In that agreement, both sides had agreed to stop all hostile acts against each other and work towards confidence building. Originally, the plan was to get rid of 22 guard posts, 11 on each side, but South and North agreed in late October to each preserve one of them for historic and symbolic value. The two Koreas plan to conduct a thorough inspection of the demolition work by the end of December. Elsewhere in the DMZ at Arrowhead Hill in Cheolwon, Gangwon-do Province, the two Koreas finished removing landmines on Friday. Arrowhead Hill was the site of one of the fiercest battles of the Korean War, and removing mines from it was also part of September's inter-Korean military agreement. The mines were removed to prepare for the first ever joint project to recover war remains from the area due to start next April. And yet more disarmament going on at the joint security area in the truce village of Panmunjom. Firearms were removed from the JSA in October, and now the two Koreas and the United Nations Command are discussing how to manage the area together, including how to divide up guard duty. The Defense Ministry spokesperson Choi Hyun-soo said the two Koreas aim to allow civilians to freely visit both sides of the JSA by the end of this year. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
Seoul has provided the necessary equipment to Pyongyang so that the regime can properly maintain inter-Korean military communication lines in the western part of the peninsula. South Korea's Defense Ministry said Friday that copper and fiber optic cable transmission equipment had been shipped to the north, which are necessary for the upkeep of the military lines. Cross-border military communications in the western part of the peninsula had recently become unstable due to aging equipment. The ministry says stabilizing the lines will contribute to securing and boosting inter-Korean military exchanges. The nation's top office confirmed when President Moon Jae-in will meet with his American counterpart Donald Trump on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Argentina. According to President Moon's chief press secretary, Yoon Young-chan, the two leaders will meet Friday local time at 3:15 p.m. or that's 3:15 a.m. Saturday, Korea time. This will be their sixth summit, the most recent one having taken place in New York back in September. Presidents Moon and Trump are expected to discuss issues including North Korea's denuclearization and a possible visit to Seoul by the regime's leader, Kim Jong-un. President Moon Jae-in is now in Argentina, the second leg of his three-nation tour. While attending the G20 summit and meeting with leaders from the world's leading economies, he'll likely prioritize diplomacy with North Korea and denuclearization efforts. Shin Se-min Foster's report from Buenos Aires.
A packed schedule from multinational meetings to sideline summit with the world's movers and shakers who are in the process of gathering in the South American nation. Among a slew of other things, the focus for the South Korean leader is his administration's push to denuclearize North Korea and forge lasting peace on the Korean peninsula. One of President Moon's top priorities in Argentina is his sit-down with U.S. President Donald Trump. The two are set to discuss ways to try and lift growing uncertainties surrounding the stalled denuclearization talks between Pyongyang and Washington. The South Korean leader also has meetings lined up with the leaders of the Netherlands and South Africa. Both are non-permanent members of the UN Security Council, and the Netherlands also sits on the UN's North Korea Sanctions Committee. And Seoul hopes the meetings could oil the gears of the denuclearization process and open up the possibility of lessening the crushing sanctions on North Korea. As for the G20 summit itself, under the theme of building consensus for fair and sustainable development, President Moon is expected to share his vision of a South Korea that is inclusive for all. The key is on what President Moon, who proposed lifting the sanctions on North Korea, would come out of a meeting with President Trump, as the two most heavily involved players in the peace drive look for ways to take denuclearization to the next level. Shin Se-min, Arirang News, Buenos Aires.
The nation's central bank raised its key interest rate for the first time in over a year. The hike pulls the numbers all the way up to the highest level since 2015. Kim Hye-sung zooms in on the decision made at the BOK's final monetary policy meeting for this year.
The Bank of Korea on Friday raised its benchmark interest rate to 1.75%. This marks the first hike since November of last year and puts the rate at its highest level since June 2015.
The board decided to raise interest rates by 25 basis points, as keeping the rate at the current level would likely make financial imbalances worse. Lending to households increased at a faster pace in October, still faster than the rise in incomes.
The BOK governor expressed concerns about growing financial imbalances and particularly the country's record high household debt of $1.3 trillion. The boom in the property market has slowed down due to the government's housing regulations, but household debt grew in the third quarter by 6.7% on year, faster than the average income growth of 4.6%. That puts more pressure on the bank to raise rates and curb lending. The widening rate gap with the U.S. is also a concern. Had the BOK left the rate unchanged, the gap with the U.S. could have widened to more than 1%, as the Fed is widely expected to raise rates again in December, which would increase the risk of a capital outflow. Domestically, the local economy grew at 2% on year in the third quarter, the slowest pace in 9 years, and some experts say the rate hike could further accelerate an economic slowdown.
The economic outlook for 2019 is worse than this year's. The rate hike is likely to slow down consumption and investment. Rates are higher, but incomes are still rising slowly, which could drag down household consumption. Companies are expected to cut back on new investment due to higher borrowing costs, which in turn negatively affects the economy.
In the year ahead, as it makes its monetary policy decisions, the Bank of Korea said it'll closely monitor the growth of global trade, monetary policy changes in major economies, domestic macroeconomic data, and the level of household debt. Kim Hae-sung, Arirang News.
Production, investment, and sales, the three main indicators of South Korea's industrial output, all inched up in October. It's the first time that's happened in 9 months. Won Jung-hwan takes a closer look.
South Korea's industrial output rebounded in October. Government data showed production in all industries rose last month by 0.4% on an increase in metal processing and logistics production. The manufacturing sector saw production go up by 1%, while the service sector saw a rise of 0.3%. Compared to a year earlier, industrial production surged in October by 6.7%. But the reason was simply that there were more working days in the months.
For the month of October, industrial activity index has shown about 7% increase over the last year. But that's mainly because of the base month period, by which it means that days of work for the month of October in 2017 was 21 days, and this year it is 26 days, so there is a 5-day increase over the year.
Meanwhile, retail sales rose by 0.2% on months, led by automobiles and clothing. And facility investment jumped nearly 2% for a second monthly gain in a row. But November is shaping up to be significantly weaker.
Main kind of engines for Korean economic growth has been the export of semiconductor, and that industry is showing some significant fall, and that's why we believe it's going to have very slow economic activity and industrial activity down the road throughout the rest of the year, because the price of semiconductors has been falling dramatically for the month of October and November.
Most economic indicators improved in October, but probably not enough to turn around the overall economic cycle. Won Jung-hwan, Arirang News.
Samsung Electronics says it will cancel more than $4 billion worth of its corporate shares to boost shareholder value. Hyundai Motor also announced a share buyback plan of its own. Ko Ryuni gets us up to speed with the developments.
Two of South Korea's largest firms announced on Friday to cancel or buy back its own shares to increase the shareholder value. Samsung Electronics said it would cancel around $4.3 billion worth of its shares on December 4th. The tech giant plans to retire more than 449 million common shares and 80 million preferred shares, accounting for 7% and 9% of the total respectively. The value of the shares announced by Samsung was based on its book value, with the actual market value being worth $19.6 billion as of market close on Thursday. This comes after the company announced in April 2017 to cancel its treasury shares in 2 stages, and it retired around half of the amount in May last year.
The most important reason for companies to cancel treasury stocks is to maintain or increase the value of their shares. The cancellation reduces the number of stocks, which raises the value per share for the remaining ones.
Hyundai Motor Company also announced plans to buy back around $223 million worth of its treasury shares. The process will begin starting next Monday and continue until February 28th. The company says this move will stabilize its stock prices and increase investor returns. Economic experts say these window-dressing moves often take place near the end of the year for a reason.
Most companies manage their stock prices at the end of the year. Because this is when they report the performance of the group, the stock prices reflect how well they manage the company.
고륜이 아리랑 뉴스.
Shifting our focus back to the G20 summit to be held this weekend in Argentina, global firms will pay close attention to developments from the event, especially the one-on-one meeting between the leaders of the U.S. and China. Kim Ji-yeon explains further.
Washington wants fairness and reciprocity from Beijing in regards to the ongoing trade war between the two countries. The main goal of the U.S. is to force concessions from Beijing for greater, more liberal access to Chinese markets. China relies on what the U.S. calls forced technology transfer, in which foreign companies seeking access to the Chinese market are required to share their intellectual property with a domestic partner. Meanwhile, China argues that as a developing country, domestic firms are at a disadvantage compared to those from abroad, which possess more advanced technologies than Chinese companies. However, the U.S. is dismissive of Beijing's claim that China is at a competitive disadvantage, saying China's technological progress has exploded over the last couple of decades. Close ties being enjoyed between Chinese firms and the Beijing government is also a concern. This has prompted many countries, the latest being New Zealand, to block proposals by Chinese telecom companies to build 5G mobile networks in their countries over national security concerns.
In terms of gaining the upper hand in advanced technology, the U.S. is pressuring China by claiming it's stealing intellectual property, while China is trying to develop its tech as fast as it can by absorbing it from the U.S.
The U.S. has imposed 10% tariffs on more than $250 billion worth of Chinese imports, and China retaliated with duties on $110 billion of U.S. goods. The Trump administration again threatened to put duties on an additional $267 billion of Chinese goods and hike the tariff rate to 25% starting in 2019. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
In the domestic political arena, rival political parties failed to reach an agreement on a new date to vote on next year's budget plan. The initial deadline is December 2nd, or this Sunday, but deliberations on the spending plan worth roughly $420 billion are far from done. The Budget Committee's review started later than planned due to political bickering, and rival parties are still divided over the funds for job creation and inter-Korean projects, as well as an expected shortfall in tax revenue. The National Assembly Act stipulates the Budget Committee has to finish deliberations by November 30th, which is today. If not, the budget is referred to a plenary session in its original form the next day, unless the parties agree otherwise. The two biggest opposition parties had proposed holding a vote next Friday, but the ruling party said that's too far past the deadline. For now, it appears that proposal will be reviewed over the weekend by a smaller group of lawmakers consisting of a representative from each party on the Budget Committee, as well as floor leaders from the three main parties. Seoul and Tokyo's ties appear to be at a crossroads. The latest event to further sour bilateral relations, the nation's Supreme Court ruling against Mitsubishi for the forced labor of South Koreans during World War II. Cha Sang-mi provides an in-depth analysis of the situation.
A diplomatic spat looms over South Korea and Japan after Seoul's Supreme Court on Thursday ordered Japan's Mitsubishi Heavy Industries to compensate South Korean slave laborers from the Japanese colonial era.
I went to Japan because I was told I can study there. But once I arrived, study was nowhere to be found. I was sent to work at a factory right away.
Some 30 young South Koreans were taken to Japan under false pretenses, only to find themselves working in a military factory. Despite the court victory, some say this is just the beginning of a longer quest for justice, as there are thousands of other wartime victims who are still seeking closure. Professor Joseph Lee says many South Koreans still feel that Japan can never be vindicated, while the government is looking to improve relations given the two countries' intricate economic ties.
So many economic experts, including those in the South Korean government, are very concerned about anti-Japanese sentiment and how breaking from all these treaties with Japan, not just 1965, but also the recent 2015 Comfort Women Agreement between Korea and Japan, that no agreement that Japan signs with Korea will be accepted in the future because of this anti-Japanese sentiment.
Professor Sachio Nekaru says while Japan is generally against a recent ruling against Mitsubishi, there is still some room for common understanding.
In Japan, from right to left, mainstream media and also mainstream scholars and even the government, they think that Korea's response is considered as very much negative in Japan. There's no question about that. But at the same time, even though they are small, but there are some voices that there must be something that Japan has to think about. This is not an issue about international law. This is more like an issue about human rights.
Experts agree, however, that both governments cannot continue to butt heads over their fraught history.
The most rational thing is to seek compromise, but it'll be hard for the two sides to find one if they push their own opinions. There have been ups and downs over the last 70 years, but they both need to be logical if they're going to make progress.
차상미, Arirang News.
Seoul is seen as setting a great example of socio-economic development. As inter-Korean ties improve, some are optimistic its experience could advance human development in the north. To find out more, our Oh Soo-young spoke to one of the leaders of the UN Development Program.
As Seoul and Pyongyang get ready for their cross-border projects, the South could have much to offer the North in terms of making socio-economic progress. That's according to the United Nations Development Programme's Director of Advocacy, Ulrike Moder. In an interview with Arirang TV, the director says she hopes the UN will be able to expand its engagement with North Korea on social development.
So the UN and, of course, UNDP being present in both countries also follow with great interest the positive steps forward. The hope of the world is, of course, to see peaceful development in the region, but also development that can bring human development to the people.
The UNDP is one of 6 UN agencies working in North Korea, having established an office there in 1979. The organisation aims to support the UN's strategic priorities for North Korea by filling gaps in nutrition, energy and disaster preparedness, especially among women and vulnerable people. The director expressed optimism that South Korea could share its developmental experience as cross-border ties improve.
I am sure and convinced that South Korea has a lot of positive examples to bring, and the Sustainable Development Goals has a heading that says, "Leave no one behind." And I know that there is also an engagement in Korea in the important area of gender equality, and this is also something that we would like to bring also to any development engagement that we have as UNDP.
The director is currently in Seoul to discuss ways to deepen cooperation with South Korea's foreign aid agency KOICA in order to share successful policies with other countries.
The experience of Korea with regard to forestation are very important areas in these times of discussions of climate change. Governance and anti-corruption, transparency are examples of areas where we can see that policies and practices in Korea can actually be exported to other parts of the world, in Asia but also in African countries.
Relations between South Korea and the UNDP go back more than 50 years. Starting in 1966, the UNDP provided the South with aid as it recovered from years of brutal colonial rule by Japan and the Korean War that followed. Fast forward to 2010, and South Korea was the first aid recipient country to become an official donor, and it's been expanding its foreign aid program since. The UNDP official hopes Seoul will continue promoting multilateral cooperation amid the rise of nationalism and populism, which could hinder the UN's global development goals. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Time to turn to Michelle Bach at the Weather Center for the updates you need before planning your weekend. Michelle, the air quality in Seoul has improved considerably, but seems like it is not the same down in the southern regions.
Yes, Daniel, pollution dissipated in the central region, but the southern regions, including Busan and Jeju Island, are still struggling with heavy air pollution 5 times higher than normal. Now, the levels are expected to spike across the whole country again tomorrow as more smog is expected to flow in. And a high-pressure system will bring clear skies tomorrow, with most parts of the country reaching double-digit highs. Same goes for Tokyo, where conditions are expected to be mild, but over in Beijing, the weather will be rather chilly. The morning temperature in Seoul will be about 2 to 3 degrees higher than today, putting at to 1 degree Celsius, and similar goes for Daegu and Gwangju. And daily highs will also be higher than today. Most places expecting to rise into the teens, Seoul hitting 11, Jeju at 17. And there is precipitation coming up late Sunday night until early next week. Afterwards, colder weather will dominate the country. I'll leave you with the weather conditions around the world.
That's all we have for you on tonight's edition of Arirang News Center. Thanks for staying with us. Hope you have an incredible weekend.